to Malta. And so shout out to Malta. I understand you have 1,400 plus persons with Parkinson on the island. And I know it's a beautiful place. And so we should work to help you to have beautiful lives. And so it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I am a professor of neurology at the University of Florida, and I come to you today in our studio here at the Fixel Institute for Neurological Diseases, which focuses on Parkinson and movement disorders. And I'll be here to answer your questions. And what I'm going to do is take you through a little brief tour of both living with Parkinson disease and also talking a little bit about ending Parkinson. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Natalie to give me permission to share my screen. So maybe make me a host or a co-host so I could do that. Otherwise, we can just talk and do questions, which is cool too. So either way, I'm happy to go both ways. But if we can do a share screen, I'll show you a few slides. There we go.
Yes, you can share your screen.
Fantastic.
I think I just changed the setting.
Yep, fantastic. You've got it.
And and also for the participants, if there are any questions, we're going to stop. We're going to stop 15 minutes before time. So please write down your questions in the messages, and you can go over them before the ending.
Great. So you should be able to see my slides. Can you all see those okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to talk about living with Parkinson's disease and also ending Parkinson's and kind of merge these two topics together. And we can answer questions about therapies or emerging things or whatever you all want to talk to or are curious about on Malta. We're here to help. I should mention that my funding, how do I fund my research, comes to an organization called the National Institutes of Health in the United States. They are the largest funder of research in the world, on the planet. And so I'm very grateful to them. And so I have many grants through them. I don't have any industry conflicts and don't work for any companies. I do serve as the medical director for the Parkinson's Foundation, which is just a fantastic organization. We have a free helpline. We have free kits for people to protect them when you go into the hospital, and all sorts of support services and a great website. And so just want you to know, if you ask me a question, I will give you the answer. I'm not biased or being paid. I am work for the state of Florida, so I'm essentially a government or state employee. This is what our institute looks like. It's completely interdisciplinary. Everything is all under one roof. And so if you're coming through Florida, we're about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes due north of a place called Disney World, which is all fine with us. We'd like to have a little space between us and the Magic Kingdom. But if you happen to be coming through Florida, we'd be happy to show you around and give you a tour. I do have a Twitter account at Michael Okun, and happy to have Twitter discussions or friend with you and retweet any interesting things you have on Malta or want to know about. And we have a blog called parkinsonsecrets.com where we interview a lot of experts on the latest things going on in Parkinson. In fact, one of our blogs went up this morning. It was an interview of a Parkinson's expert, Dr. Jill Farmer, and it was on telemedicine tips and myths about how we're going to connect into people's homes. So I think I mentioned a bit that we have been writing and hard at work, and either fortunately or unfortunately, these two books have both come out since Corona has hit us. The first, Ending Parkinson's Disease, A Prescription for Action, came out in March of this year. And then just a couple of weeks ago, this book was supposed to follow, but got caught because of Corona in Robert Rose Publishing's warehouses. And because they couldn't get people there to unload and move the books out and mail them, they actually got stuck until a few weeks ago. Now this book is out. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about both and try to interweave here some of the things that we have learned. We'll talk a little bit about this notion that Parkinson may be a pandemic or considered a pandemic, a very controversial notion, but certainly something that is a little bit fun to talk about given the fact that we're all sort of muddling our way through the COVID-19 issues.
We have done the impossible before. The suffering we experienced, it pushed us forward. It did not stop us. Stigma was there. Our brothers and sisters marched on the streets until it wasn't. The challenge inspired us. Together, we rose to the occasion. We fought back. And we will do it again. We will end Parkinson's. Our fight begins now.
So that's just a little trailer for the book that appeared in March, and that is the idea that we need to better understand what it takes to end a disease. It's not a book about, how tomorrow we're gonna flip a light switch and be done with Parkinson's. Parkinson isn't one disease. It's probably many different subtypes and many different genetic and non-genetic forms of a human disease. But in order for us to get control and move on the path toward ending Parkinson's, we really need to learn from other diseases. And so we did quite a lot of research for the book, looking at other issues such as HIV and AIDS. We looked at breast cancer. We looked at polio, interestingly. And we, by looking at those diseases, we've learned quite a bit about what it would take for us to move that needle to try to end a disease. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and also talk about where care and where this other book, Living with Parkinson's, fits in. So it is the fastest growing neurological disorder, faster growing than Alzheimer's, than stroke, than Lou Gehrig's disease, than brain tumors. And so this should be a bit mind-blowing. And if we put it into terms that you may be able to identify with, if you were in a class of 30 people when you were growing up, throughout your lifetime, 2 of you will get Parkinson's. So 1 in 15 over a lifetime, another mind-numbing statistic. The projections are really kind of scary. And so if we look, this is put together by Ray Dorsey, who's one of my co-authors on the Ending Parkinson's Disease book, looking at 25-year epochs. So the time interval between 1990 and 2015, the growth goes from 2.6 to 6.3 million. You may notice that that's more than doubling. And again, from 2015 to 2040, going from 6.3 to 12.9, also more than doubling. And look at how big the numbers are getting. So if we don't pay attention to this, not only are we going to have the healthcare burden, but we're also going to have the economic burden, and we have the potential to actually bankrupt our healthcare systems. And so this is something that we really do need to pay attention to. Now, people have said, well, you have a disease like Parkinson's, and Parkinson's is a degenerative disease. And the longer that you live, the more likely it is that you'll get Parkinson's. This is all true. And perhaps the greatest achievement of the last 100 years has been the doubling of the lifespan. Not the computer, not the cell phone, it's the doubling of the lifespan. That's quite an amazing accomplishment. As you can see from this graph, the average age that people lived in the 1850s and 1860s was only at just under 40 years of age. Now, age is a major factor, and we say if you live long enough, your chances of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and other degenerative diseases do skyrocket. But age cannot account for this rapid growth alone. So there must be other things that are driving the growth of the disease, and that's one of the issues that we examine in detail in the Ending Parkinson's book. So let's talk a little bit about some of the common myths, some of the things that aren't true about Parkinson's. Well, first is that it's all due to aging. It's just an aging disease. That is a myth. We know that's not true. It's a myth that it's not treatable. And the 1,400 plus people on the island of Malta, hopefully you understand that there are actually good treatments and you can live a happy life with Parkinson's. And it's one of the things that we wrote about in one of our previous books, The 10 Secrets to a Happier Life. And that there's nothing to be done about Parkinson's risk is another huge myth that we must push back on. We now have lots of information, lots of associations that we see that we should be paying attention to and we should be thinking of in a preventative or public health sense. Now, some people have compared the growth of Parkinson's to a pandemic, and you all are part of a pandemic now. Now, the word pandemic, it takes its roots from Greek and Latin. Pan means everywhere, demos means people. And when you put those two together, you begin to think about diseases that may have common characteristics that go across large swaths of geography. Now, we know or we believe that Parkinson's is non-infectious, but it does exhibit many of the characteristics of a pandemic. And in 2013, when we wrote the 10 Secrets to a Happier Life book, in that book, I was quoted as saying, Parkinson's is like a pandemic. And in fact, this Ending Parkinson's Disease book, the original title was The Parkinson's Pandemic. Now, wouldn't that have been great if we had kept that title? And that title was changed by the publisher pre-COVID because they thought it was a little bit too edgy, but it probably would have sold a lot more books if we had left it as the pandemic. But let me try to convince you that Parkinson's is like a pandemic. Pandemics extend over large geographic areas. Check the box for Parkinson. It certainly does that. Pandemics tend to migrate, and the burden appears to be shifting in response to changes in aging and also in industrialization, and that growth being driven by industrialization. Check the box again. There's exponential growth in a pandemic. Again, the box is checked, and no one is immune to the condition. So I think that we all agree that it is appropriate that we use the word pandemic to describe infectious diseases like polio, like COVID, corona, or COVID-19 infection. I think that's reasonable and how people identify with it. But I just want you to know the word didn't originally mean just infectious. And though it's probably not useful to use it to refer to Parkinson's, I think the dialogue is so important to realize how similar the growth is to a pandemic. So what's the next step for Parkinson's disease? And we have to think, well, what have we learned? And so when we went back and wrote this book, we studied polio and HIV and breast cancer and other diseases, and we write the stories of these diseases and what it took to move the needle and potentially lean in to try to end the disease. And we realized when researching this that there was a common pact. There were 4 pillars that were important to making a difference in any disease. And those pillars are prevention. That's the P in the word pact. The A in the word pact is advocate. You got to strongly advocate. The C is caring. So there's a generation of people now that we've got to care for. And the T is the development of new treatments. And so we realize that for any disease to move the needle, to tip, and to make it to the point where we could say there's a potential, like with polio, for ending the disease, these are the 4 major pillars. So let's talk about the P pillar, prevent first. And certainly we now know that there are multiple studies within the scientific literature that tell us the environment is a risk factor and can be a risk factor for the later occurrence of Parkinson's disease. Does that mean every case of Parkinson is caused by the environment? No, it doesn't mean every case is. But when we see certain compounds, when we see certain dry cleaning chemicals, when we see certain pesticides, with something called an odds ratio, that's like when you take a bet in Las Vegas. If the odds are above 1, the chances of it being associated or you winning your bet is going to be much higher. Now, you don't want to win the Parkinson bet, but we have now paper after paper with replicable science, meaning we've seen it multiple times on the same chemicals and the same pesticides, now suggesting a strong association that with adequate exposure later on, this increases your risk to get Parkinson's. So we should pay attention. I think I'm going to try to convince you that why would we not pay attention to this data that we have? Exercise and rehabilitation therapies have been considered as a potential for preventing the disease or delaying the disease. We don't have that information yet in humans, but we do have it in animals, and it is an interesting area of research. And people are applying drugs and devices both in preventative and in slowing or trying to protect the brain from loss of cells. Now, in the 10 Secrets book, I talk about 3 buckets, and I think this is a useful analogy. So people talk about when you develop a therapy, you're thinking about bucket number 1, which is very powerful symptomatic therapies like dopamine or deep brain stimulation. Bucket number 2 would be drugs and devices that might prevent or slow the disease down. So maybe you die of something else. Sounds a little bit morbid, but we call that the bucket that affects disease progression, slows disease progression. So one treats the symptoms, one bucket is full of therapies that slow disease progression. The third bucket is the C bucket, the cure bucket. So these are things that we're thinking about maybe with single errors in the DNA or genetics, maybe we can come to a cure eventually of those. And so that's the bucket we're furthest away from, the C bucket. We talk a lot about the symptomatic bucket, right, of symptomatic therapies like drugs and devices. And then that middle bucket, we're still searching for things that will slow or prevent the disease. So how about pesticides? Well, we know now that the bets are pretty doggone good that pesticides are associated, many of them, with the later occurrence of Parkinson, and we need to ban specific pesticides and we need to ban specific chemicals, and this could be very important to prevention. One example I'll offer you is a pesticide called Paraquat, and some of these you may have in your garage, okay, where you store your car. I know in the United States, we stack all of our chemicals up on the shelf, and now we look back and say, oh my God, we had all these chemicals that cause different diseases like cancers and Parkinson. But this is one called Paraquat. It's the pesticide with the strongest link to Parkinson's. It's been banned in 32 countries. I don't know if it's banned in Malta, but it probably is. But in the United States, its use has actually doubled in the last 10 years, doubled in the last 10 years. And so we're headed in the wrong direction. And this could be a way toward trying to prevent some of those cases of Parkinson. And you can see here on these gray bar graphs from 1992 to 2016, this is the amount of Paraquat in millions of pounds that's used. And if you look at this map, this brown, the darker brown is showing you all these areas within the continental United States where Paraquat is in use. This is unacceptable. And it is one of the areas that we could work hard to improve our prevention of those cases associated with this and with other pesticides. Now, when we say side, C-I-D-E, side in Latin means killer. So when we see pesticide or herbicide or insecticide, and you know what you're trying to do. You're trying to kill plants, you're trying to kill animals, you're trying to kill fungi. And so some of these sides can also be toxic and down the road be associated with the later occurrence of Parkinson's. It's also very important that you ask yourself where you live. And in the United States, as in many industrialized nations, we have dumped chemicals and we've had spills and we've had contamination of our water, and we've had sites that need to be cleaned up where industry has maybe had a factory. And my house is actually 11.3 miles from what's called a Superfund site. And a Superfund site is a site where the American government has actually said, we are going to pay to clean this site up because there's some sort of bad chemical that's in the environment. And in this case, it's dioxin, which is one of the components of something called Agent Orange. And Agent Orange was used in Vietnam, and it's called Agent Orange because of these orange barrels that it was stored in. People actually don't know that history, but it's just that simple. And this has a causal a potential association with the later occurrence of Parkinson's disease. And so this Agent Orange is one example. And again, you have to ask yourself, in what environment do I live in? And am I at an increased risk? In terms of chemicals, so before we talked about those sides, those killers, now we talk about chemicals. Probably the one that's most important to talk about is called trichloroethylene, or TCE. It's commonly used as a degreaser or in the dry cleaning business. And we know, even going back to 1932 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that the failure to disclose the toxic nature of the chemicals may be associated with these industrial spills. And we have seen very high, what we call odds ratios, linking this to the later occurrence of Parkinson's. So again, when you talk about prevent, I think we need to talk about these lists of chemicals that we're learning about. So that's the P impact, P-A-C-T. The A stands for advocate. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to try to end a disease, we've got to be very powerful advocates. So Natalie Muschamp is one of your powerful advocates in Parkinson. It's so important to have Natalie Muschamps. We need to clone her. We need to have really thousands and thousands of Natalie Muschamps out there, and perhaps millions, to make sure that we're advocating at a level where we can move the needle and change a disease. And so we actually studied a couple of diseases for the book Ending Parkinson's. One was polio, and another is HIV. And in polio, we know that having an advocate can mean the difference between success and failure. And polio had its greatest advocate in the White House. This is the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he's talking to the famous comedian Eddie Cantor, and you can see they're holding dimes all over his desk. And actually, people mailed in dimes to try to end polio. And that's where the foundation, the March of Dimes, comes from for neuromuscular diseases. And so super important. And it really moved the needle having this level of advocacy. It's so important. Another example is the advocacy in HIV, which has been really insurmountable, going from a disease that was totally neglected to one where we galvanized all of our resources to get on top and to create really powerful symptomatic treatments and to make this a chronic livable condition for many people. This is an example of a condom that was placed over the top of Congressman Helms's house, saying Helms is deadlier than a virus because he kept voting against HIV legislation, and this he never voted against them again. And so they were very, very effective in advocating for their position. The HIV advocates have seized the control of the United States Food and Drug Administration. So again, a very aggressive, a very forward-looking A in that advocacy. So if I had to look at our Parkinson's, excluding Natalie Muschamp, who's a great advocate, I would say, how are we going to grade our response? Well, at least in the United States, we grade our children A through F, and I'd give our response an F-. And I'm saying I'm part of this too, so I get this poor response. We have had a disappointing go at advocacy. We need to rethink this. The disease, Parkinson, continues to grow unchecked despite our efforts, and so we really need to redouble. Now, we have a group called the PD Avengers that I believe Natalie is part of. This is a group now, I think it's grown to about 500 people, and we aim to have 50 million, that's with an M, 50 million people sign our pact, P-A-C-T, our pact to end Parkinson's, both people who have Parkinson's, but also people who are affected by Parkinson, family members, friends, everybody. We need to move the needle. We need to get more funding. So how about care? That PAC, there's a generation of people who have Parkinson now who need adequate care for their disease. And so this is where the second book called Living with Parkinson's Disease comes in. And so we've written a series of books. Some of you may know my 10 series of 10 Secrets to a Happier Life. Well, this is the third book in that series. And this is all about what are the things we can do today, okay, to affect Parkinson's and to help people to live a better life. Now, we selected Robert Rose Publisher to do this book with. They're a very famous publishing company out of Canada. I mentioned Canada because their warehouses got shut down because of COVID-19, so our poor books got stuck in the warehouses, but they're out now as of a few weeks ago. And why did we choose Robert Rose? Well, if you look at Robert Rose, what do they publish? They publish cookbooks, and they're super good at making lists and boxes and putting information in a way that's digestible. And so we worked with the Robert Rose people to try to put a lot of the information for Parkinson's disease persons in a format that would make it easier to digest. And so they could use the information instead of having another book that collects dust on your shelf. Now, one of the things that we stress is that it's time to change our image of Parkinson's, and we published this paper just a few months ago in JAMA Neurology, and it shows the pencil sketch of Parkinson's disease from 1886 by Sir William Gowers, and this is how everybody thinks of Parkinson's, and in fact, when they give their talks, everybody shows that picture, and we have been strong advocates that it's time to throw that picture away. That does not represent Parkinson's. And so this is by Melissa Armstrong and myself in JAMA Neurology, showing all the different phenotypes of Parkinson's. You see the young woman, you see she's active, her foot's a little turned, but she's walking or running. We see a man who's completely functional in his suit, and the difference between his off time and his on time with tremors and dyskinesia. And then maybe you see some people that have that Gowers type, but certainly not all. And above on the top, we talk about all of these non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease, autonomic symptoms, psychiatric, and cognitive. So first of all, we need a makeover. We need to change our image. And within the book, Living with Parkinson's, this is Bob Dean, and Bob was kind enough to go around and shoot these beautiful pictures. He's just a gorgeous photographer, and his work is really tremendous. And these are all people with Parkinson who are living better, good, happy lives with Parkinson. So each one of our chapters starts with one of these people with their picture to show you that it's possible to live a good life with Parkinson, a very important message. Now we have to think about simple things. And so going back to the 10 Secrets book, I always like to say, knowing what you have and knowing what you don't have, so knowing the signs, is super important. And even the most faithless among us are waiting to be proven wrong. And so understanding what you have is super important. Now, all of you that are with Natalie, you all understand you have Parkinson's, and you all understand that no two of you look the same. And you also understand that with appropriate physiotherapy, advanced therapy, and medications, and a good, what we call multidisciplinary approach, you can have a great life. But the majority of people across the globe mistake Parkinson's for Alzheimer's or for ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease. And it's a shame because people think their life is over when they get the diagnosis. And so we try to preach, and I've done this since 2006 with the Parkinson's Foundation, strongly in all of the books that we've written, that knowing what you have and knowing your potential for success is super important. And that sounds like a simple tip, but not everybody has a great group like you do in Malta. Now, another tip that I'll give you comes from Joshua Harris. This has been written about by many authors over many generations. And the gist of it is this idea that the right thing at the wrong time is the wrong thing. And, you know, I just can't tell you how many people that I meet that are so overwhelmed with all of the different medications and therapies and things that they can do with their Parkinson, and yellow pills and purple pills and fuchsia pills and black pills, and what do I take? And it turns out that what's more important than the total number of therapies is the timing of your therapy. It's absolutely critical. And Parkinson, both from a neuroscientific standpoint, so I have a laboratory and I'm a scientist too, functions with a group of circuits in the brain that are intensely tied to timing. And how we treat this disease, understanding the timing of medications, the timing of our therapies, and how we administer our therapies is in fact just as important, if not more important over time than any specific therapy that you select to treat this disease. It's such an important lesson. Now, another lesson that's a bit of a darker gray lesson comes from Jared Kintz. And I love this quote, and you'll have to forgive me because it's not the nicest quote. But Jared says, "I have a favorite cemetery I go to because it's really clean and the doctors and the nurses are all very nice." And it turns out that we started this helpline for Parkinson, and I used to do this gig for many years, a decade and a half, called Ask the Doctor, where we answered thousands and thousands of questions from all over the globe and every continent except for Antarctica. And we'd hear these terrible horror stories when Parkinson patients would go into the hospital. And it turns out that the hospital is not the safest place for a Parkinson patient. Although Florence Nightingale said that the first requirement of the hospital is that it should do the sick no harm. And so we couldn't figure out how to deal with this. And now we've given out over 100,000 of these kits based on about a dozen research papers that we published through our integrated network of centers of excellence through the Parkinson's Foundation. You can get this kit from the Parkinson's Foundation. It has a toll-free telephone number, 1-800-4PD-INFO. I will give that to Natalie offline so you all can connect. And they also have nurses that will answer your questions if you have specific questions. And it's just a great helpline, but also access to one of these kits. So if you go to the hospital, you've got everything you need in the kit. It's got a list where you can put all your medications. It tells the doctors, it tells the nurses, it tells the therapists, I need my medicines on time every time. We know 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 patients don't get their medicines on time every time in the hospital. It tells them what medicines not to give you. And some of the medicines are common and could be messed up and confused with migraine medicines and medicines to restart your stomach once you've had a surgery, and that can set you back in bad and profound ways. And so this is certainly a great tip to understand how to protect yourself if you end up going to the hospital. Another tip from the book, Living with Parkinson, is about exercise and rehabilitation. And I know Natalie is a famous or former famous dancer and likes to dance as one of the therapies. And one of the things that I will tell you and tell Natalie is that bad therapy in Parkinson is actually worse than no therapy. Let me say that again. And we put a tip up every week on our Twitter account and on our Facebook account about living with Parkinson. And last week's tip was bad therapy is worse than no therapy, because it turns out that Parkinson isn't like traumatic brain injuries or back pain or other issues. It's totally different. And if you give the wrong kind of therapy, if you give just whatever the generic therapy is that your therapist knows how to do, you can actually do worse, fall more, fracture things, and do worse. Another tip in rehabilitation is that if you're coughing when you're eating, this is something that should prompt a immediate evaluation by your team to see if you are putting food down the wrong tube. People don't think about this, but having a nice powerful cough keeps you from getting pneumonia. But if you're coughing while you're eating, perhaps this food is getting down into the wrong pipe and into your lungs. And that's one of the things we worry about the most in Parkinson's disease. So we need to play prevention there. And finally, bursts of therapy are not ideal. And that's how we give therapy around the world. Somebody has a stroke, somebody gets in trouble, they go to the hospital, they get assigned a therapy, they go see a doctor, the doctor, uses their power of their prescription pad, gives them a therapy, here, have 6 to 8 weeks of this therapy, and then go away. You should get better. That's not how it works in Parkinson's. You don't want to have everyday therapy for 6 or 8 weeks. You want to see Natalie or somebody like Natalie once a week or once every 2 weeks, maybe get a personal trainer, get an exercise program, and then be doing it continuously year round. Remember, I told you, timing is critical in this disease. And finally, what's the best exercise? Is it meditation? Is it forms of Tai Chi? Is it certain forms of strength exercises? Is it dance therapy with Natalie? Well, the answer to that we don't know based on science, but we do know that the best exercise is probably the one that you're willing to do. So we think about pearls, and we have lots of pearls in the book. Another pearl that I will tell you is don't fall victim to this thing called levodopaphobia. Levodopa meaning the dopamine replacement that we have and we give for Parkinson's disease. You're not going to get a medal. You're not going to get a reward. You're not going to get a gift card for delaying therapy. And too many people that we see have read all these internet sites and things, and they're convinced that if they don't take the medicines, they're going to do better. It turns out they do worse. And we know that now. And we should be communicating this to our individual persons with Parkinson's disease. If you're having trouble, if it's affecting your quality of life, if it's affecting your work, if it's affecting your balance, you should be starting medicines, and you're not going to get that time back. So you should enjoy it as much as you can. One of the most exciting areas, I think, is nutrition and the microbiome. So it's the 7th chapter of the book. And I love the quote, if you don't take care of your body, where are you going to live? Super important, and one of the things that we just have not come to terms with, but I'm so happy to say both here at the University of Florida, we have 2 full-time nutritionists who also do research, and we have a big collaboration with our nutrition department. We have scholars that are moving in the area of microbiome. We have a Parkinson's Center of Excellence here through the Parkinson's Foundation looking at those gut to brain interactions, and we're starting to learn. And when I say starting to learn, I just mean we're at very basic levels. You know, it's like if you read the Bible, it'd be like, you know, we're on the first, you know, paragraph in Genesis of the first of 5 books. I mean, we are really early in the process, but we're starting to understand that there may be different diets. There may be changes in the microbiome. There may be ways in which we can change ketosis that might have a positive benefit both on the symptoms, but also on the disease. So do I have the answer to this? No, but will I tell you, watch this area. There's a whole bunch of garden, you know, books out there that'll sell you books and saying they have the answers. They're all wrong. Nobody has the answers yet. Okay, so if they tell you buy my vitamin or whatever, probably should be very cautious of that type of talk. But watch the studies, because as we get the studies, we're going to begin to figure this out. And I think this is one of the most exciting areas. Neuropsychiatric and behavioral symptoms are super important. And one thing that I like to remind folks here and around the globe when I lecture is it's not just depression. Depression is certainly the largest unmet hurdle in Parkinson and is one that we can treat. And we talk about it, and we should be talking more about not which color antidepressant do you get or which new one or an old one. It's all about what dose you get and what follow-up you get and making sure that's adjusted and making sure that we're managing you. Too much of this, you know, like, oh, you have a little bit of depression, here's your pill, goodbye, I'll see you in 6 months or a year. That is totally the wrong way to approach treatment of depression, anxiety, and all of the other mood issues. We have to be very serious. We have to follow people up, you know, within weeks, not within months, and we have to keep people safe. But one area that we have completely blown it on and done a terrible job is called demoralization. So 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 persons with Parkinson are going to get demoralized. That means they're going to get down, and their doc or their team is going to mistake them for having depression or anxiety. They don't necessarily have to have depression or anxiety, but they are actually getting down because they're of the disease and the burden of the disease. And it's something that we can address, but we need to identify it. We need to come to terms with that. And so it's so important. Finally, the T is about treatment and development of new treatments. And so we talk about the research and where is it going and what are the emerging therapies. And so I often say people are waiting, they're waiting. And I like the picture of the man or woman standing on top of the globe looking at their watch. I love that picture. I've used it my whole career. I think about it every day because there are people with this disease who are waiting, and they frankly need to have relief as soon as possible. We know that we're underfunded. So if we're going to make a dent in this, we're going to have more funding. So in HIV, they got $3 billion a year from the National Institutes of Health, and this prevented thousands, if not millions of people from ever developing HIV. And in Parkinson, we only received $201 million in a year. And so this is just not acceptable. It's not going to move the needle. And why should we better fund Parkinson? Well, dopamine replacement pills are the best treatment, but the treatment is over 55 years old, and the treatment doesn't stop disease progression. So you can see here pictured the old dopamine pill, Sinemet, Matapar, depending on where you live. This is the old yellow dye number 5 or number 6 that gives it its color. And this is an old treatment, old steady. And look at where Parkinson is versus arthritis, breast cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and diabetes. Pitiful. We're not going to move the needle like we did for polio and for HIV. Now, what are some of the things that are on the horizon? Well, we're going to begin to target specific genes and people with specific genetic abnormalities. And this represents about 15% of all folks with Parkinson, but this may be the beginning of precision medicine. So I think we're going to see this in our lifetime. A lot of work going into the LRRK2 and the GBA mutations. These are 2 common mutations. We have new drugs and old drugs like arthritis drugs that people are resurfacing for treatment potentially of Parkinson and new targets in the brain. And we have devices and new neuromodulation treatments that we're thinking about. And so remember I told you there are these different buckets, and one of those buckets is knowing how to affect disease progression or slow disease progression. And so this is a quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the president who was sitting in the White House during polio. And he said, one thing's for sure, we have to do something. We have to do the best we know how at the moment. And if it doesn't turn out right, we can modify it. So what we want to do with the bucket number 2 is modify how a disease expresses itself and the speed of diseases. And so these are blood pressure medications, medications for gout, medications for diabetes, medications for malaria. You've heard about resurfacing malaria as potential COVID therapies. Doesn't work for COVID, doesn't work for Parkinson well either. But thinking about ways that we can maybe use things that are already there and available to try to change disease progression. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt had it right. We're already doing this. We do this in my laboratory for the last 10 plus years. We've been working on these therapies to pick up the signals that come out of the brain and have the devices respond to the signals in real time. We call this closed loop or adaptive deep brain stimulation. So the next generation of therapies. And then, of course, we're thinking about the immune system and how the immune system and how inflammation are important to diseases like Parkinson's. And William Foch said vaccines are the tugboats of preventative health. And we actually have a number of vaccines, one here at Florida. There's a bunch throughout the world that are being tried. And the question is can you turn the immune system against these bad proteins, clear them off the brain? It's like taking a toothbrush to the brain. And will it make a difference? Or will you still have Parkinson, or will you just have a clean brain without these bad proteins, or will you get side effects? And so working on the immune system is another really cool and interesting area you're going to see more research on, and working on all the inflammation, the inflammatory response of these cells that are going to these areas and they're on fire. And so trying to put those fires out may have a benefit in these diseases. On the horizon, we're using things in the laboratory like optogenetics, which combines the genetic engineering, optics, which is light, and light-sensitive molecules. And we can use this on animals to get very precise millisecond control of circuits and things in the brain. And it helps us not so much as a treatment, like we're going to put this in your brain and shine light on it. Maybe we will one day. But if we can modify these circuits, turn them on and off, and understand them, once you understand something, that's when you can develop a rational treatment. And so optogenetics has been important. And then one thing we haven't talked about enough in Parkinson are these DREADs, or designer receptors, that are exclusively activated by designer drugs. And so these are things that have been used in cancer therapies. And so getting these designer drugs to go where we want them to go, turn on and off things as we understand them better, is going to be super important to thinking about a future. And then finally, if you think about where we're going, we need to be able to measure the disease, okay? We need to understand whether you have the disease or not, but even more important than that, we need to be able to track the progression of the disease over time, with some sort of very tangible, real, what we call biomarker. So in this case, this is imaging, but it could be blood, it could be spit, it could be another fluid, could be many different things that might tell us the activity of a disease over time. And if we had such a readout, like a dashboard that told us what was going on in your brain at all times with Parkinson, then instead of enrolling thousands and thousands of patients into each one of these studies, we would only need hundreds of patients, because we'd be able to tell whether or not drugs or devices or exercises actually have a benefit, because we'll have something that can track it. And so the development of these biomarkers, not just for diagnosis, we're pretty good at diagnosis, not perfect, but to track that disease over time, and then to track as we intervene and give therapies over time, super important. So this is one by David Valancourt at the University of Florida. So thank you for the invitation to speak. It's been great. I feel like I've been on the island of Malta. It is in the 90s here today in Florida. So I know you all have even better weather than we do for much of the year. My Twitter account is @MichaelOkun. My blog is parkinsonsecrets.com. I do work for the Parkinson's Foundation, and I'll send Natalie the information for our free helpline. And if you do get a chance to pick up the books, Living with Parkinson's, I'm told it's out of the warehouses, and Robert Rose's warehouses in Canada. Ending Parkinson is out. Hopefully you'll be one of our 50 million people that sign the Parkinson's Pact, and I'll send Natalie that information. And if you get a chance, leave us a review on Amazon. It helps to get the word out, and all the proceeds are going to charity. So it's been really great to spend the hour with you. And if you have questions, I'll stick around and answer your questions.
Okay, thank you, Michael. That was really, really, really interesting. Very good. Can everyone hear me? Yes, can you hear me, Michael?
I
Yes.
can.
Okay, good. So if you have any questions, please write them in the chat, and then I will discuss them. So right here, your question. Just wave, and then I can ask you to unmute if there's any questions.
What do you do for fun, and what do you do for fun in Malta?
For fun at the moment?
Without pre-COVID, what was the most fun thing that you all do in Malta?
Well, we danced together, and we were actually working on an awareness tour. So everyone, we were performing, and they would be performing, the participants, and we would create an awareness tour to about Parkinson's disease in the role of the caregiver. But we had to cancel it.
Well, it'll be back.
Yes.
Don't give up.
No, and we're actually now in the process of creating a little documentary about that process and what we do with the organization. So are there any questions? Does anyone have a question? Just unmute, and then you can ask the question. I think there are no questions, I think. So, but we're gonna have the webinar on our YouTube channel. I will upload it tomorrow and share it on social media. And also, I would like to encourage everyone to sign the pact agreement, and to so we can create more awareness. I see there is a question. No. Okay. Okay. So.
This is my email address as well. I'll leave that up for a second in case anybody wants to email me a question. That has my, it's Okun at neurology.ufl.edu.
Hello.
Yes, who's this?
Sorry, because I am late, because I am working at the moment.
Okay.
I just want to know if it's any cure for the Parkinson's, like therapy or something.
Yeah, so there is no cure to date. There are people that will charge you $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 for tourism type of cures. Since 2006, I've served as the medical director for the Parkinson's Foundation. So I have been involved with checking out every claim, and every few months we see a new claim, about Parkinson, and you'll see it in the papers too. This is the cure for Parkinson, but then you or Natalie will look at it and you'll say, well, that's in a mouse, how could that be human? Yes, so at least in that case, there might be something down the road. But But in terms of a cure for human Parkinson's disease, one does not exist. Now, I must tell you from my own personal experience that that there is a one person who has been credited with curing a nun with Parkinson's disease, and that was Pope John Paul II, and that was one of the reasons that he received sainthood, is that he supposedly cured a nun of Parkinson's disease. In actuality, I don't want to shock anybody, but Pope John Paul did not cure anybody of Parkinson's disease. It's an incurable condition at this point.
Okay.
Because I'm really late for this session. That's why I didn't understand most of the things. But I already had views about Parkinson's, not only in the YouTube but also in the Google. But I don't think so if it is enough what I heard.
Thank you for your question.
Because most of the cases here in Malta is Parkinson's and dementia but most of them had Parkinson's. That's why I want to know more about in Parkinson's.
Great. Well, Natalie,
yes.
Natalie has recorded the talk as well. So, you'll be able to go back hopefully and take a look. And if you have more questions, you can call our 1-800 helpline. I'll send that to Natalie as well. If you all need any help, we're here to help.
Okay, we have one question from Maria Carbonara. She's thanking you for the wonderful lecture. How can we sell to policymakers the benefits of increasing resources for PD patients? How can we highlight the cost effectiveness when most of the patients are in retirement age? Thank you, she says.
Right, so that was Maria?
Yeah.
Okay, so Maria, thank you for your question. It's super important that that regardless of our ages, that we engage in this, very aggressive advocacy. And one of the issues that we uncovered when writing the book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, is that we haven't been aggressive enough. We haven't been obnoxious enough. We haven't been in the faces of our officials enough. We're letting them get away with the passive, let's do nothing attitude. But it is incumbent. It is our responsibility to show them the data. Okay, and so when we're doing studies and we publish studies, that's why we need to have venues that we can show them through Twitter, through social media. We need to get the word out so that we're telling our story, and we're not telling our story well enough. And so Natalie talked about, well, I've written all these papers, hundreds and hundreds of papers. Nobody reads the papers that I've written, right? I mean, so more people read these books than have read any of the research papers. We got to change that. We've got to have the research that we're doing get out there and show your politicians and show your public health systems that it makes sense for them to embrace this, because if they don't, the public health systems are going to collapse under the weight of the tremendous numbers of people that are growing with this disease. And so it is going to affect so many people, and 2 out of every 30, that's a lot of people over a lifetime, that we have got to be more aggressive. And this was the formula that was effective for breast cancer and for HIV. And in order for us to do that, we're also going to need to increase our funding by a full 10 to 15 fold of where it's at right now in order for us to generate that data. Now, my final comment is this. We have to be smart about what research we're doing and how we present that research. And so it's probably not at this point wise for us just to say, okay, here's a whole bunch of money and let's do whatever we want. That's kind of how we functioned in Parkinson up to this point. And that's great because we discover a lot of things. We've got to take some percentage of that and say, we need a study that's going to show what Natalie Muschamp is doing is important, and what is the data that she's going to need to talk to the Maltese officials to have them embrace, the programs that you'll need that will change your lives and save the healthcare system money, instead of her, hoping, that the right thing is going to come at the right time. You've got to put the tool in her hand so that she can use it appropriately. And so we have to be more let's say deliberate. You know, we have to deliberately deliver blows and punches now, and we haven't been as deliberate as we should be.
Okay, there's one last question, if it's okay, Michael. It's from Charles,
absolutely.
and he is asking, is there any ongoing research that shows that certain medication do actually improve walking and balance and speech?
No, walking, talking, and thinking are still the largest unmet needs for Parkinson. Now, there are some individuals who have Parkinson that do get improvements in these areas, and that wanes over time. Not everyone, and certainly these are not just dopaminergic symptoms. And so this is where our laboratory and a lot of laboratories are spending a lot of time. This is a large unmet need. So you get DBS and you still end up progressing and having these issues. So walking, talking, and thinking are 3 of the largest unmet issues. It's a good question.
Okay. So, any other questions?
Well, thank you all. I think we are, we have mailed a few books to your group too. So we'll donate a few books, and hopefully you all, you know, everything's going to charity. And if you leave some reviews up for us, we would love it. And just do well, Malta. You got 1,400 people with Parkinson. Do well. And if we can help you, we're here to help.
Yeah, I'll definitely stay in contact with you.
All right, fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been an honor, Michael. And thank you everyone for being here. And we will upload this soon on our YouTube channel. And yeah, really thank you again. It's been really, really, really great.
Pleasure's mine. Have an awesome day, everybody.
Okay, bye everyone. Bye. Bye, bye, bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah.